Professor Paul, your recently published book is titled Indivisible, Daniel Webster and the Birth of American Nationalism. Without even knowing it, the word indivisible is ingrained in the minds of most Americans, no doubt, because we say it so mindlessly when we recite the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So why did you incorporate this really massive word, indivisible, into your book's title?
Well, I think that it's important to realize that at the founding of our republic, the country was not indivisible, that the Constitution was, in fact, from a historical point of view, it was, in fact, a compact of 13 sovereign states. And in order
by a compact, Professor Paul, you mean like an agreement?
Yeah, it was basically,
Wow.
it was like the European Treaty. It was basically a treaty between 13 sovereign states that largely preserved their independence in many respects. And it was its chief accomplishment over the Articles of Confederation was that it eliminated barriers to trade between the 13 states and established a customs union, essentially. John Rutledge, who was a Supreme Court justice, once famously said that the framers got together to write a constitution and they founded a nation by accident, which is essentially what happened.
Wow.
To create a nation, it was necessary to create a myth. And the myth that John Marshall and Daniel Webster, John Marshall is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Daniel Webster is the leading advocate before the Supreme Court in his day. The myth that they created was that the Constitution was the organic expression of the will of all of the American people, that it wasn't just those white guys with property in a room in Philadelphia who wrote the Constitution and people like them who subsequently ratified it in the different states. It was all of us vicariously represented by them, that we had all somehow assented to this essentially social contract that bound us together as a nation and made us indivisible. And of course, Webster is arguing this point in the context of the constant threat of secession and nullification by Southern states. And so he had to persuade people that this was an indivisible union. And the way he did it was because of the power of his oratory.
Yeah, you talk about that in your book quite a lot, and it's very impressive. I can even sort of feel it in the written word. In your book about Webster, you attribute this to Webster. You say the Constitution is the glue that would hold the Union together. I think it's your interpretation of his work. Do you think that statement applies now? And I asked that question in particular because of what our former president, Mr. Trump, said apparently in social media about suspending the Constitution. Do you think the Constitution is still a glue, or do we pay less attention to it these days?
It's a good question. And, I teach constitutional law. And one of the ideas that I try to impress on my students is that the Constitution exists in two forms. There is the written Constitution itself, the words on the page, but there is also a culture of constitutionalism, which infuses and informs everything we do as a nation. When Donald Trump tried to orchestrate a coup to prevent the peaceful transfer of power on January 6th, that coup was prevented not because of the words on the page of the Constitution, but because of the men and women who were willing to risk their lives to defend the principles and the legitimacy of what the Constitution represented. So the Constitution today, Mr. Trump can talk about canceling the Constitution. He talks about terminating the Constitution. He has to terminate not just the words on the page, but the thinking in the minds of every American that is what informs us about the legitimacy of our form of government and indeed of our social life.
Um, in your book, I came across a really interesting passage. You suggest that Thomas Jefferson and his party, the Democratic Republican Party, which sort of continued all the way to the end of Monroe's presidency, 1824, placed the Declaration of Independence above the Constitution. Essentially, Jefferson was not exactly overjoyed about the Constitution. I've read this in other sources as well. Professor Paul, you realize that this interpretation is probably new to most Americans, right? Are you suggesting that Thomas Jefferson's party placed 4th of July above other important days in our history? For example, the ratification of the Constitution or the first inauguration of a U.S. president, George Washington. Did I get your sort of story here correctly? Am I paraphrasing it nearly? Go ahead.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. And I mean, one could ask the question, why on earth do we celebrate July 4th as opposed to the ratification
I don't think anyone
Washington's birthday or George Washington's inauguration or any number of other holidays? We celebrate July 4th because Thomas Jefferson made it a national holiday. And he made it a national holiday in a self-serving way because Thomas Jefferson claimed falsely that he was the sole author of the Declaration. He wasn't. He wrote the original draft of the Declaration, but it was, of course, then subsequently reworked by a committee. And Jefferson, of course, he had a laboring hand in the drafting of the Declaration, but he wanted it to be a statement associated not just with him, but with his party. And so he uses July 4th as a celebration of the Republican Party. And that's what the origin of July 4th was.
That is fascinating.
And July 4th, I should also point out one other thing, which is the Constitution, up until the time of Chief Justice John Marshall and his decision in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, up until 1803, people were kind of vague about what the Constitution was. Was it a law, or was it simply a kind of a oratory statement of goals or a kind of state of principles,
aspirational,
kind of like a mission statement for the country? Was it only that, or was it law? And it was Marshall who elevated the Constitution over the Declaration of Independence. It was Marshall who basically says the Constitution is law. The Declaration of Independence is a bunch of nice words on a page, but the Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
For our listeners who suffer from family feuds, I just want you to know Marshall was Jefferson's cousin, and they didn't quite get along, right?
Yeah, they hated each other. That's right.
They hated each other. One of the things that came to mind as I was reading your book is recently we had other episodes about Chile, about Iran. No comparison with the United States, but the point that piqued my interest is that Chileans or Iranians had actually voted for their various constitutions. And I'm not saying those are good constitutions. I'm just saying the act of actually voting. And as I read your book more, and I'm listening, I'm reading about Daniel Webster. I'll share one line here with you: the people's constitution, the people's government. The people of the United States have declared that the Constitution shall be the supreme law. These are words from your book. It sort of occurred to me that we Americans never voted for a Constitution. It's never happened, right?
Well, not only that, but when they wrote the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention was not supposed to be a constitutional convention. The Constitutional Convention was supposed to suggest changes to the Articles of Confederation. And, James Madison shows up with a draft of a constitution in his back pocket and says, let's do this instead. So the Constitution itself, and then they created their own process by which they would ratify and make it the Constitution. The whole thing was unconstitutional. Our Constitution is unconstitutional. and they did all of this, and people kind of went along with it, but it wasn't in any sense approved by a majority of people. Now, you could say, well, the guys who went to the ratification conventions in the various states were themselves elected. But they were elected by a handful of white propertied men.
Yeah.
Women couldn't vote. People without property couldn't vote. African Americans mostly couldn't vote. Native Americans couldn't vote. So they didn't represent America. And so there had to be this sort of process of mythologizing the Constitution as the organic expression of the American people. And that's what Daniel Webster did through his rhetoric.
That's really fascinating. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Professor Paul as we get into the perspective.